Hi guys, welcome to another video tutorial on applying your skills to other languages. In this session, we're going to learn how to migrate our any in a row program that we built previously to Python. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know Python like I do C#, but as a developer, you'll work in companies that will require you to work with just not .NET but other technologies. In this case, maybe Python or JavaScript running on Node or something else. So that's it. This is going to be a learning experience for me, and I hope for you as well. I will try my best to show you how you can apply what you already know to other technologies. For you experienced developers who are doing Python, if you see this video and if you see something that can be improved, please make sure to drop a note so that we can all learn from you. So the first thing we want to do is learn about Python, not in a programmatic way, but from a developer experience. Sure, you can download and install Python, but what other options are out there for .NET developers and Python? What IDE should you use and such? So the first thing we have to do is install Python. Now, I'm not going to go step by step on how to do this, but we'll discuss the process. After a little bit of Googling, you'll come in and find that you need to be on python.org. And if you go to the download section, you can actually download Python for any platform. And I have downloaded for Windows because that's the environment I'm going to work. But like .NET Core, you can install it in other OS systems. So once you click download and go through the prompts, you will have some options with Python. So if we were to go ahead and search our computer, you'll see that you have this Python IDLE, and then you have the manual, which is the chum files. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. This is the old way of the help files that Windows had, but it's still usable. So as you can see, they have good documentation here that you can go through, and you can actually search for it as well. So this is on your computer installed, and pretty much you can do without being on the internet, you can do all of this stuff, and they have some tutorials here as well. So the next thing is, if you look, Python has this 64-bit command line. So if we go here, we can actually interact with Python. So for right now, I'm going to ask Python to print something to the console for me using the print command. Now that it's done, if I hit enter, you'll see that it printed hello world for me. So you have this interactive command that you can use. Next, if you search your computer again, you'll have this IDLE. So if you click on that, we have something very similar to the command line, but it's more into a Windows format for us. And you can pretty much do the same thing here. So you can just say print and hello world. And if you hit enter, you get hello world. But this is cool because it gives you color coding, and so you can see what's going on. One thing to note is that because of this shell in Windows that's been developed, its DPI is not quite correct. So if you go, for example, and say path browser, so here I think everything looks good because I fixed it. But if you do have it, find the executable. In my case, I already have it in here. So I'm going to right click on it and go to properties. So this is where the file is. What we want to do is go to compatibility, and then we're going to go to change DPI settings. Notice that I've already have this set. If I uncheck this and click OK and click apply, and now if I go here, I may have to restart this. Yes, I have to restart this because it was already restarted with the options. So what you will see, depending on your resolution on your screen, things are not going to come up correctly. Yes, you can navigate through them, but you can't really see anything. So the option is for you to go here, go to properties, go to compatibility, and go to DPI settings, and check this little box, and make sure this is I sign into Windows. You do have the application. I've noticed that this works better, and click OK. Click apply, and if you exit, now everything should present correctly onto the windows. So if we go back to our path browser, and you can see that everything is looking okay. So what is the IDLE? Well, this is the Integrated Development Learning Environment. Basically, it's like a IDE. You would have like a notepad or something like that, but very specific to Python that you can play around with. This is basically a playground. Well, what options are available? So if you go to Visual Studio Code, and in here I do have a firstbench.py, which is the extension for Python file. And I have my hello world here. And basically what you need to do is you need to go to the extensions and then search for Python and then choose the Python from Microsoft and select that to install. Once you install it, then you can create a file. The file name can be anything. And in here again, we have our hello world. And if we go to our run command, start debugging, Python file, and it's going to execute this command. And we have our hello world in here. So that's another IDE you can use, which is totally free, and it gives you good options as far as color coding and everything else. Something else you can use is PyCharm. Now, PyCharm is a program that's developed by JetBrains, and you can Google it and find it. So actually, let's go to that. I have the community edition, which is free. There's another editions that is you have to pay for. Okay, so once this is loaded, I have that same file that I had in my Visual Studio Code in here with the print hello world. Then we have of course our project and whatever libraries you have. Next, you would execute this program, and then you should see the hello world printed, which we do. Now this was a little bit faster than the Visual Studio Code, so you might want to decide which one to use, whether it's this one or the other one. The other thing to note is that if you did start a project, you would not have a configuration file. So what you would have to do is you would have to create a configuration file. And in here, if you create it, you would give your script path and choose the default options. Now I'm using Python 3.10, so we can keep that there. Or if you have other Python versions in here, you could select that as well and click OK. So whenever you're running this, make sure that you are on that configuration so that it can execute your file that you want. So that was PyCharm. Now, is there another option that you can use? We can use Visual Studio 2022. Now, in order to use Visual Studio in Python, we would have to actually go to the Visual Studio installer. And I've already done this, so I'm going to just show you what I did, and then you can choose to do the same thing for yourself. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your Visual Studio is updated. Now, when you're running Visual Studio installer and you're making changes, make sure to close your Visual Studio. Otherwise, you'll see a message while it does the install or upgrade or anything that you have an instance running and you should close it. So here I have the latest one because it does not tell me to update. And let's go ahead and click Modify. When you click Modify, you're presented with options that you can add on top of Visual Studio. You can add and remove stuff. And one of them is Python. When you select this and you choose to install this, I've already done it, so that's I don't have the option. Something else you might want to also do is you want to go to the Python development and make sure that you're choosing Python 3 64-bit as well. This is the supported version. This is not the 3.10 that we had seen before. So once you install that, let's go to our Visual Studio. And in here, I've already got a project created, but we'll go through the options. So we'll just go create new project. In here, if you choose Python and you'll see the option available, then you can choose to create from an existing code or Python application. So you can choose Python application because we've already had one. Choose next, and then you're presented with the same wizard that you would have for any of the .NET applications that we had done. So I already have one created. Go ahead, create yours. Let's close this and let's go ahead and open the one that we had. Now, if you do this, you'll see the two versions of Python. You want to make sure that you are on the Python 3.9. So if you go to the application and click properties, make sure that the interpreter is set for Python 3.9 and not the 3.10. Because if it is the 3.10, you'll have some warnings and errors that will pop up for you. So now that it's done, if you click Start while you're in your file and making sure that this is Python 3.9, we'll have the command line executed, and we have our hello world printed out. So moving forward, our development experience is going to be using Visual Studio because that's what we've been using and that's what we're familiar. But you can choose to use the other options that you had, and that should be fine too. The code's still gonna be the same exact thing. So in our next step, we're going to go ahead and learn about Python, and at the same time, we're going to migrate our program 5 in a row or win any in a row. So here we are, win in any in a row game console. And the idea here is to kind of take a look at see what features of .NET we've used and how to migrate this over. So let's go ahead and open our notepad so we can make some notes on what we need to do and basically what features we've used. Now, looking at this, we know that it's a console application, so we have things like reading from the console and writing to the console, right? We also clear the console, right? Because we have to keep showing up the board as the user makes moves. Okay. Then we have, for example, let's see what else we have here. We're setting some values, so we have some data types, right? So we have ints, bools. We definitely work with strings. We have actually classes that we use. Let's see what else we have. And we have, well, we have loops, right? So we have a while loop, and we have a continue in our while loop. And let's see, we have conversion of the data types, right? So while looking at this, I can see that there are some categories that we can put these buckets under. So this one would be the system functions, and so that would be this over here. And then this would be the statements, right? And this would be data structures. And even the conversion of these objects are done within the data structures. So the other thing is that in here in the classes we have methods. Our classes have properties, and that's actually if we go to our game engine, these are the methods, and we have some fields here. I believe we have properties here, so that's where that is coming from. And then if we actually look at, so we're doing some exception handling, so that would be part of the system stuff. So we have exceptions. In the statements, we also have the if else, right? Let's see what else we have here. We're dealing with arrays, which is the data types. So let's go back to here. What else do we have here? Okay, so that's pretty much, I think, what we have. Let's actually take a quick look. So we have our while loop. Okay, so we have do loops in here. So let's go back in here. And then I believe we also have for each loops in here as well. Let's go take a look. Yep, we sure do. So we have for loop, and all of these loops have continues and then also they have breaks, right? And let's see, what else do we have? And we do a little bit of math in here, right? So that would be math. Okay, so this is basically what we need to learn in Python in order to convert our application. So what we'll do is we'll start from the very beginning over here and start having some variables and then create some loops, print some stuff out on the screen, and then move on from there, learning one piece at a time what we need to do. So we'll do that next. So when you create your Python application, you might see the following error message. And this is because what we mentioned earlier, having Python, the higher version that Visual Studio does not support. So just click OK, and then you'll get also this warning. You can ignore that as well. So if you go to the Python environment, you'll notice that we have the 3.10. This is the one we downloaded. This is the latest. But unfortunately, Visual Studio has yet to support that. So we're going to go ahead and add environment. And we're going to downgrade to the 3.9. So after a few moments, you should see now the Python 3.9. And if you go to your properties of your project, it should say the interpreter is Python 3.9. As well as when you run the program, now the environment is set to 3.9. So now that we have that set up, what we can do is change the file name to main. So this will be the same as our Visual Studio C# project where we had the main.cs file. So let's go back to our file. I've updated this a little bit to kind of understand what we need to do in order to migrate the C# application that we created. First, the code commenting. So if you want to comment your code in Python, you would use the pound key. Anything after this is going to be comments. Another way you could do this is to have 3 double quotes, and then you can put anything here, and then you go ahead and put 3 more quotes so that it would end it. So this way, when we want to have the Python commands, it actually would not have an issue with it. So if you did not have this, everything would be commented. So this is the 2 ways that you can add comments to your code. Next, how do you write and read from the console? Well, you've seen us already do this, and that's using the print. So we can have print, and when we run this, it's going to print hello world to the screen. Next, if we want to get a user input, what we need to do is use input. But this input needs to be assigned to a variable so that we can use it later on. So now if we run this application, so now you learn how to print to the screen and capture user input. But there's one problem here. When we printed, everything went to a new line. So for example, if we run the application again, notice that the cursor is now underneath and it's creating a new line. How do we actually just do a print without that? So to do that, we need to have a ending of nothing, meaning that at the end of this string, we don't want that terminator, and instead we just want just an empty string. So now if we run the application, the cursor will be in front of your text. So now you know how to print to the screen and then capture the user input. How do we clear the console? So in order to clear the console, we need to use the operating system functions. So if you were to go ahead and open up your console, and then you have the dir command that will return the directory of where you are, which is, this is system 32, you would see a lot of this. To clear the screen, we would just type CLS, and that would clear the screen. So Python doesn't have a function here like the print and input where it would actually clear the screen. We would have to do that ourselves. And to do that, we want to use import. Import is similar to what we had in C# where we used the using statement and then had a namespace. So here we're just going to say import sys, and then from here we can say sys. Actually, I made a mistake. It should not be sys, it should be OS. We want the operating system functions. So then we can say os.system, and then we can say CLS. So if we run this, now you see this little font that is trying to do the clear screen. Unfortunately, when Visual Studio runs this into the Python command line, the CLS is not interpreted properly. So it's not able to clear the screen for us, but we do see the command being initiated. To run this and actually see the command working, we can actually run this through, to see this actually working, we can actually open a command line, either in Visual Studio or using the Windows command line. And then we can say Python and then have our file passed to it. And notice that it is able to clear the screen without any issues. So if we were to actually do the same thing with Windows command line, so now we can say Python and main.py, notice that it was able to clear the screen. So this will work, except that it will not work when you're doing the development and running your program. So far we've learned the following. And now how do you manipulate strings and do formatting? So you already saw one function where we do a plus. Another way to do this is to use the kind of like in Visual Studio when you use the $sign in front of the string so that you could do an interpolation. So we could do the same thing, and then here we can actually type name and then take this name out. So let's go ahead and comment this for now and run our program. So now you see that the formatting works properly. Now how do you do math and exceptions? Well, to do math, we could say 5 plus 5 and then print test. Let's go ahead and comment these guys. So we should see 10. So this is very similar to C#. You could also do min or max. So this way if you want the minimum number, it should be 1. But if you wanted to do the square root of, let's say, 5, then we would have to import the math module. So now we can say math.square root of 5. Okay, so far we learned the system functions we need in order to migrate our application. Let's go and talk about how to do that using the statements, which is loops, if, and do, and for loop. So next we're going to learn about the while, if else, and the do and for. With Python, when you're doing loops, there's only 2 loops. There's the while loop, which is very similar to C#, and also the for loop, which is equivalent to a for each loop in C#. there's no really a do, and then we also have the if else, which is very similar to C#. So let's start with the while. So we're going to start with the while command, and then we're going to have a condition. In here we could just say true, and then this would continue executing forever. But the other thing is that when you're setting this while statement, you have to tell Python that this is the end of the while, so that when you go to the next line, this is where the scope will start of the while. So everything inside of this will be part of the while statement, and we can say hello world, and it'll print it, forever for us. We need to put a condition so that this actually stops after a few iterations. So we're going to create a variable called loop condition, and then we're going to set this to true. So this way we'll continue to loop until we set the condition to false. So next, again, as you see, we have this indent, and which means we're selling the scope of the for loop, and we're going to say if loop. Well, we need to have another variable to keep track of what we're doing, and we're going to say loop counter, and the loop counter is going to start with 0. So if the loop counter is equal to 5, we want to stop the iteration, so we're going to set the loop condition. Notice that when I hit enter, we actually went to the same position in the if condition. What we need is for the if to start from over here. But the problem is that we actually didn't terminate the if. Similar to the while, we need to put the colon to tell Python that this is the end of the if, and so that the next line is going to be the scope for the if. So anything starting in this indent would be part of the if condition. So here we're going to say the loop condition is going to be false, because we don't want to iterate after this. So the next thing we want to do is increment the loop counter. And the way we did it in C# was to do plus plus. Here we're going to say plus equals 1. This will actually add 1 to the loop counter. So let's go ahead and run our program, and we should have a few iterations. And then once the condition is equal to 5, we set this to false and get out of the next iteration. And there you go. So that's how you do a while loop. The next thing is we could do, for example, instead of having the loop condition to false, we could do something else. Let's go ahead and comment this. And the next thing would be is to actually use break. And this should also break us out of the loop condition. Let's go ahead and run that. So the break and continue should work very similar to how C# is. Let's go ahead and comment these guys for now. And now let's go ahead and learn about the for each. Now to do that, let's go ahead and create an array. So we'll create array numbers, and the array is going to be brackets instead of the squiggly lines we had in C#. And we'll say 1, 2, 3. So we have this array now, and we need to now iterate through this. In C# you had the enumerator, which would enumerate for you. So in Python, we're going to say for, let's say number, and array numbers. So then we're going to have our terminator to tell Python that this is the end of the for. So now when we hit enter, we are in the scope of the for loop. In here now we can just say print, and let's go ahead and print the number. So if we run this, we should have the 1, 2, 3, and we do. We could have the if condition here as well to say if the number is equal to 2, break, or we could have continue here as well. It would work the same as the for loop. Now, to be able to iterate through objects that have a list is great, but then how do you do this if it was similar to a for int I equals to 0 greater than x linked I++, the equivalent of the C#. To do that, we would use, for example, a object called range. So if we say range, and then we want the length of the array, so we would just use another keyword, len, length. That's for length of the array. So this should give us the length of the array. And then we're going to print the numbers. So if we execute this now, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and not 1, 2, 3. And the reason is that we actually asked for the location rather than the value of the array. So to get that, then we could actually ask for the array and then pass the location of the array to get the actual value from the array. So executed now, we should see 1, 2, 3. And we do. But this is great. But how do you do multidimensional? Because ultimately our board is going to be multi-array. So this is one array, which is inside of another array. And let's make this 4, 5, 6. And let's make this 7, 8, 9. So how do you iterate through this? Well, first we need to iterate through the rows. And then we need to iterate on columns. So we can just say then range. Let's go ahead and comment this out for now. But the thing is that what if we had, so this works because it's 3 rows and 3 columns. But what if we had an additional column here and additional column here and additional column here? How would you get the column numbers? So then we could just say get the first array condition and then get the length. So basically we're saying go to this array, which is the 0 condition, and get the length of that. So now we're going to get 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we did the length of this array, it went through the multidimensional array rows. So this would be 1, this would be 2, and this would be 3. So now if we go and do a print statement and we ask for the values, so then we can say array numbers and we're gonna use the row and then the column. But let's go ahead and change the ending of this, because what we want is for this not to have a new line. Once we are out of the column, then we can just do a simple print, which will give us a new line. Let's go ahead and run this, because what we want is we say 1, 2, 3, 0, and then a new line, 4, 5, 6, 0, and then a new line, 7, 8, 9, 0, and then it'll be new line. Let's try this again. And there we go. So we have 1, 2, 3, 0, 4, 5, 6, 0, 7, 8, 9, 0. So this is how you can deal with the loops, if conditions, and be able to iterate through the multidimensional array. Let's go ahead and comment these guys. So now we have data structures. And how do you deal with integers, booleans, and strings? Now you've seen some of this already in action. You've seen how to create multidimensional arrays and work with them. You've seen us create strings and format them and to be able to print it to the console and accept values, which will be always string, and then convert that to an integer by using the int, and then also working with Boolean values. Converting the data types, you've seen us how to do that. So you can actually take, let's say, int string, and let's actually have 5 in here. How do you convert this to int number? So how do you convert this? You just say int, and then we pass our int underscore string, and this will give us the integer representation if it can convert it. So then the next thing is, how do you create classes, methods, and properties? Let's go over that next. So before continuing to go over classes and methods, I wanted to come back and go over the range a little bit. So if I create a variable test range, and I set the range of 10, by default what will happen is if we do now a loop on this, so if we say for test and test range, and then we do a print on test, what it will do is it will go through and print out the numbers going up to 10. So let's go ahead and run this so we can see this in action. So we start from 0, we go all the way up to 9, which is actually 10 because we're starting from 0. And by default what it did was it started with 0 and stepped one condition up. So if you wanted to change that, what you could do is basically start, let's say, from 2. So we're going to start with 2 instead of 0 this time and go all the way up to 10. Let's go ahead and run this again. Okay. Now, if we wanted to change that even further and say we don't want to step by 1 and want to step by 2, for example, then what we should be getting is 2, 4, 6, 8, right? Because we're going to start from 2, go up to 2 increments. So we got 2, 4, 6, 8. So this is another way you can get the, you can modify your for loop to kind of be more similar to the for and I and C#. The other thing is you can also test these values by asking the start, which is the start getter, or the stop, or the other values in there. So let's go ahead and comment that out. Let's put this up here. All right, so now let's come back to this. So this problem that we had where we took the string and tried to convert it, but the program halted because we threw an exception. Now we're talking about how to work with classes and methods and function, basically functions. So how would you do this in a function that would help us so that it wouldn't throw an exception? Well, if you did this normally, you would just do a try catch. And then you would continue, but we want to create a method or a function, depending on which word you want to use, so that it would be reusable, so we don't have to duplicate code all over the place. Now, just as in C# and Python, they're exactly the same, meaning that when you create a function, you could just have a function that returns no value or doesn't accept anything. It just does some calculation or some code, and it will finish, and then the execution comes back to the caller. Or you can pass it some values and it'll act on that. Or you can have values coming in and then return a value back to you. So let's actually create a function that's going to emulate the C# version of end try parse, right? So we used to be able to take a string and do an end try parse to make sure that it could be converted. So if we decide to go with the function, what we first have to do is start our function with a def word, which is the keyword for starting the function. And we're going to name our function int try parse. And then we're going to accept a string So let's actually call this string number. Okay, and then similar to the other if and while, we need to put the colon to tell Python that this is now the end of the function signature, and anything that's indented will be part of this scope. Next, we're going to start with a try, and we're going to have our terminator, and then we're going to say return. We're going to return true. We're going to return true if we can convert this to an int. So if we say int string number, then we want to return true. Now, if we can convert it, then we're going to be throwing an exception, which we need to catch that. So to catch that, we're going to say accept value error. And this is going to be the catch sign. And in here, we're going to return false. So now, if we call our entry parse, so we're going to say if entry parse, then print convert it, else not a number, right? So let's go ahead and run this. So now notice that when we executed this program, we're getting this exception that says the entry parse is not defined. Now the reason you're getting this is because Python starts from the top and then executes at the bottom. So it means that in order for us to use this function, the function has to be before what we call it, so that Python then knows about it. So now if we execute this, it should execute successfully, and we get not a number. But what we need to do is we need to be able to return a number back if we can convert it, because otherwise we have to do the conversion again, right? So what we need to do is return this. In C# we have something called by ref by value. In Python we don't have that. And so what we can do is we can return multiple values. So we can just say the first value we're going to return is going to be true. The second value is going to be the number that we can convert. But then what happens in the exception side? Well, we can just say none. We're not going to return anything. So now if we execute this, we're going to have two values. So what we're going to do is take this, and we're going to have result, and we're going to have a number. And then we're going to call our method. So what it's going to do is we're going to stuff the true or false in here, and then if we had a number or none in here. So then we're going to say if the result is true, we want the int number. Otherwise, we're just going to say not a number. So let's execute this. It's not a number. But then let's actually change this so that it is a number. So now we have 5. So this is another way to be able to create a function. You can pass it multiple values if you have things that you want to return by value or excuse me, by reference, because we do have that in our program. So this is what we'll be using. So now that we learned a little bit about how to create functions, let's actually go through and create classes. So let's go ahead and comment this and start a new class. Now we're gonna emulate creating a game engine class, so kind of show how to do a constructor with it, have some properties and a method that we can call. And then after that, I'll show you the actual code that I've converted, because pretty much everything that we've gone over so far will be able to be translated so that you can actually write and migrate the C# program into Python. So we start off with the class keyword, and then we're going to have a name. And in this one, we're just going to call ours game engine. And then we're going to terminate, so that way everything inside of this scope now is going to be part of the class. And we're going to create a game board. And this game board is going to be an empty array. This is going to be our multi-dimensional array. And then we're going to have a maybe game status. This is going to be -1. So remember that if this was a 1 or a 2 or 0, 0 meaning that we still have moves on the board. 1 was that it was I think winning, and then 2 was when it was a draw. So here we'll just initialize this as -1 so that it's let us know that the game hasn't been initialized. And then after this, what we can do is now create the functions and constructors. We'll go start with the constructor. And so to define a constructor, we will do the same thing as we did the method, except that when we are creating the constructor, we'll say, it's going to be __ init _. And then it's going to have the values that you can pass it. And for us, what we're going to do is just keep this as self, and I'll explain what this self is. This is pretty much like the keyword this, as in this object, and you'll see how we're going to use this in a minute. So the values that we usually pass to the constructor or C# program was basically the game board rows. So we'll just say game board rows, or you can just make this even more shorter by just saying rows, and then we can say also columns, and then we had the when and a when in a row, the number we need in a row in order to have a winning move, right? So this is now our constructor, and then inside of this we would actually validate if these rows and the winning were set up correctly, meaning that if we have number of rows of, let's say 3, and then we had one in a row of 4, that's not acceptable. Or if we had our one in a row less than 3, right? So let's just go ahead and now, before calling the method, let's actually define that method. So we're just going to say define. So here we're just going to create the function, and we'll call this validate game, actually win in a row, and we'll say self, and then pass in a row win. So let's terminate that so that we can actually have a function. So now we're going to say if the self win in a row, if the win in a row, so we need to make sure that win in a row is greater than 3. If it is, then what we want to do is return true, else we're going to return false. So now how do you call a method in your own class? This is where the self keyword will come in handy. So we just can say self dot validate, and we're going to pass it the win in a row, which is going to be this one. Just copy and paste this. Then we can say if this is true, actually if not true, then what we can do is raise an exception. And we're going to use the raise value error, and we're going to format this when and a row must be greater than 3. Actually, we don't really need this. Or if you wanted to have you could actually have one in a row here, so you could just actually say greater than that number, but we'll just say it's going to be greater than 3. So we can remove this if condition. So that's our class. Now let's see how we can call this. What we can do is we can say now what we need to do is pass the constructors. So we're going to say 8 rows and 8 columns, and we're going to say 5. So this way there's no exception being raised. So let's go ahead and execute this. So again, we have this error, which we should put our creation underneath so that Python knows about our class before we actually construct it. There we go. Now if we change this to be a 2, we should have an exception, and we do. And we have the exception which says one in a row must be greater than 3. Alright, so this is pretty much everything you need to know in order to convert the program, the C# program, to Python. But I'm going to go ahead and go through the code with you. So here's our C# program, and we have 3 classes in here. We have the program with the main method where the game logic is getting started for us. And then we have the game result, which is a helper method that we created to identify the valid move and have messages for the main function to decide what to do when the user puts invalid information. Then we have the game engine, and the game engine basically holds all the information to support our game. Now if we were to go back to our Python program where I have converted it, I've done exactly the same thing where I created a main.py, game result, and game engine. So the main.py has all the functionalities that the program.cs would have, and then the game result is the helper class that we have created, and we have the game engine where we have the logic of the game itself, all migrated over to Python. So if we were to go to the main.py, now here we don't have a main method, but what we do have is a bunch of definitions. So if we were to go here, we have our game draw board, get player marker, heads up display, and print console, similar to what we had in our C# program. So if we go here, we have our draw game board, get player marker, heads up display, and then print console. All of those has been migrated over. The other thing is that we noted that in order to use the functions, they have to be declared first. So all of the functions are declared up here, and then the main logic of the game starts here. This while loop begins our program where we ask the user for some questions with a game board size and what the win in a row size should be. Once we have that input, we actually set the value to false, and then we start the main logic of the game where we iterate through as the player makes moves. One thing to note is that when we created the while loop, we are iterating similar that we did before in our examples, except this time we're accepting the input from the user and we are using a function is numeric, where before we had the int value to convert this to an integer value. So if this is not numeric and the user made a mistake, then we show the information here to have them correct their mistake, and then we use the continue keyword to start the loop over again. So once we satisfy that, then what we do is we set a main logic loop for the game, and then we have the game engine where we call the class when the constructor with this board size, rows and columns, and then have the win in a row value. Now, this is a little bit different because in our previous program, where we were learning Python, we created a class in the same area, in the same file, basically. So how do you actually reference a Python class that is in a different file, which is this one over here? So now if we were to go up, we use the import.os. So this is all our options for accessing the operating system functions, like the CLS to clear the screen. Next, we have this from keyword, the game engine, and then we have an import of this class. So from game engine is basically the name of the file, and then import is the name of the class that we are importing. So if we were to go to our game engine, this is the name of our class, and that is what we are asking for over here. So once we have this reference, we can then go to our main logic and access our class. So here's now we have our game engine. We start our main loop, clearing everything, the questions that we ask the user, and we start the program where we ask the user to insert rows and columns to place markers on the board and continue the game. This logic remains the same, where we have the main loop and then we have the game inner loop. We continue the loop until we have no more positions to move, where we have a win or a draw, and then we display that to the console, to the user. Again, this is a very simple class, so we don't have to really go over this. We have just some values in here, valid, move, and message. Then the game engine has the same thing, where we are accessing the game result class. And to do that, we actually start from the game result, which is the name of the file without the .py, and then import the actual class. Now that we have this, we can access the game results inside our game engine to be able to fill the data and return it back to where we can use it in the main.py. Everything else here is the same. As you can see, we have our functions, we have if conditions, and we have return values. One thing is different here is where we're accessing to see if the game is a winner by checking the horizontal, vertical, diagonals. And if we go through this, you'll notice that we decided to use the while instead of a for loop. And the reason for this is because we have two conditions here, where we have this condition and this condition to be met. And this could not have happened in the for loop, because the for loop iterates through a list or an array, right? And so this is why we have the while loop. And also we are creating the row and column positions, and we're incrementing that within the while loop. And then we have the continues and breaks inside of it. And that's the only thing that's different in our program from between the C# and the Python program. Everything else is the same. So we'll go ahead and make this code available to you. Hopefully you have enjoyed this as much as I did. And good luck. We'll see you next time.